Picture a steam locomotive so long it cannot fit around its own railway. 14 driving wheels, locked into a single rigid frame, stretched across more than 100 feet of solid steel, and built for one purpose only to be the most powerful engine its country had ever produced. Now picture that same machine tearing the track apart beneath it the moment it tried to turn a corner. This is not a thought experiment. It was real. It was Soviet. And for one brief and very strange year in the 1930s, it was the largest rigid locomotive on the face of the earth. The Soviet Union called it a triumph of socialist engineering. The railways that had to run it called it something far less flattering. Because somewhere in the space between ambition and physics, the engineers had built something the track itself could not survive, and the question that would shadow the entire project was deceptively simple. Was this the most powerful locomotive ever made, or a monster too big to run at all? There is a point in engineering, as in almost everything, where bigger quietly stops, meaning better, where the dream of more outruns the ground it has to stand on. The story of the AA-20 is the story of that exact point, and of a country that flatly refused to believe it existed. So let's find out what happens when a superpower decides physics is a matter of willpower, because the answer involves bent rails, a publicity stunt, and a machine that was hidden away and erased so quietly that most of the world has never heard its name. To understand why anyone would build something this absurd, you have to understand the Soviet Union of the early 1930s. The country was throwing itself into industrialization at a breakneck, almost violent pace. Factories were rising out of farmland, output quotas were sacred, and the railways were the iron arteries holding the whole experiment together. Freight tonnage was climbing faster than the locomotives could haul it, and the leadership wanted engines that were not just powerful, but impressively powerful machines that could move mountains of coal and steel across a continent and prove a point to the world while doing it. So a group of Soviet engineers traveled to the United States to study the biggest freight power on the planet. And there, on the Union Pacific, they found their muse, the colossal 9000 class, a locomotive that carried 12 coupled driving wheels in a single frame, more than anyone had ever dared to couple together. Most engineers would have looked at that machine and seen a limit. The Soviet delegation looked at it and saw a starting point. If America could build 12 coupled wheels, then the Soviet Union would build 14, bigger, longer, unmatched. A locomotive no capitalist nation would ever attempt. But here is the detail they chose to ignore. There was a reason no one on Earth had ever built a 14-coupled engine. It wasn't a lack of imagination, and it wasn't a lack of steel. It was a problem buried in the geometry of the railway itself, and the Soviets were about to discover it the hard way. The project was handed, somewhat awkwardly, to Krupp, the famous arms and steel firm in Essen, Germany. This was the brief window before the politics of the coming decade made such cooperation unthinkable, and the Soviets were happy to borrow German precision to build their Russian giant. The locomotive began life on the drawing board as one design, was altered mid-construction, and was eventually shipped east and finished at the locomotive works in Lugansk, in what is now Ukraine. There, the final pieces were fitted, including an enormous firebox riding on its own set of trailing wheels, sized to burn the low-grade coal the Soviet railways actually ran on. And then there was the name. They called it the AA-20. The 20 was straightforward enough, it referred to the 20-ton load each axle was supposed to place on the rail. But the letters were the interesting part. AA stood for Andrei Andreev, a senior figure in the Soviet political machine who had thrown his weight behind the project. And that tells you almost everything you need to know. This was not just a locomotive. It was a prestige object, a machine with a politician's name welded to its flank, which meant that failure would not simply be an engineering disappointment, it would be a political one. In the Soviet Union of the 1930s, that was a far more dangerous thing to be. When it was finished, the AA-20 was genuinely staggering to look at. It stretched roughly 110 feet from end to end, the longest rigid frame ever bolted under a single locomotive, a record it would go on to hold for years. 14 driving wheels, each well over 5 feet tall, marched down its flank in an unbroken line. It carried two enormous outside cylinders, a boiler pressurized to punishing levels, and a tractive effort that promised to drag thousands of tons of freight without breaking a sweat. On paper, it was magnificent. On paper, it was exactly the machine the Soviet Union had set out to build, a single engine that could do the work of two, a monument to industrial might rolling across the steppe. But paper does not have curves, and the railway did. This is the part of the story that most people never get to, and it is where the whole thing quietly falls apart, so stay with me, because the failure is far more interesting than the boast. To understand what went wrong, you only need to understand one idea, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. A railway is not a straight line. It bends constantly around hills, along rivers, through stations and junctions and freight yards, and a locomotive has to bend with it. That is why almost every truly enormous locomotive in history was articulated, built in two or more hinged sections that could pivot independently, like a snake easing around a corner. The articulation is not a luxury, it is the thing that lets a giant move at all. The AA-20 had no articulation whatsoever. All 14 of those driving wheels were locked into one single, unbending steel frame. The 7 axles were spaced about 1.5 meters apart, which added up to a rigid wheelbase of roughly 10 meters, a third of the entire locomotive that could not flex, could not pivot, could not yield a single degree. Imagine trying to steer a 30-foot steel ladder around a tight corner without bending it. That was the AA-20 on every curve of the Soviet network. The engineers were not fools. They knew exactly what they were facing, which is why they tried to cheat physics before the locomotive ever turned a wheel. Their solution was a kind of compromise that bordered on a confession. They stripped the flanges, the raised lips that keep a wheel on the rail, clean off the 3 middle driving wheels, so that the center of the machine could effectively slide sideways across the track on a curve. Then they gave the first and the last driving axles a measure of side-to-side play, hoping the two ends could shuffle just enough to follow the bend. In other words, to make a 14-wheeled locomotive negotiate a curve, they had to design wheels that were deliberately willing to leave the rail, and the obvious uncomfortable question hangs over the whole arrangement. If your fix is to let the wheels slide off the track on purpose, what exactly is keeping the thing on the track in the first place? They were about to find out, and so was everyone standing nearby. In 1935, the AA-20 was finally let loose, and the regime did what regimes do with prestige projects. It made a spectacle of it. The locomotive was sent on a publicity trip toward Moscow, a chance to show the giant off to the public and the press, to let the photographs do their work. And for the cameras on the straight, it must have been an extraordinary sight. The longest locomotive in the world, 14 wheels gleaming, hauling its load with that remarkable pulling power the design genuinely did possess. For a few glorious moments on tangent track, the boast looked real. The Soviet Union really had built the biggest rigid engine on the planet, and it really could pull, and then it met a curve. What happened next is the moment the title of this story stops being a metaphor. As the AA-20 was forced around the bends of an ordinary railway, that enormous rigid wheelbase began to fight the track with brute mechanical violence. The flangeless center wheels skated. The frame refused to follow the curve and instead tried to take the shortest path straight through it, which meant shoving sideways against the rails with the full weight of well over 100 tons of locomotive. The track was never built for this. The Soviet main lines of the era ran on relatively light rail, and the AA-20 attacked them. It spread the rails, gouged the railheads, and abused the junctions and points where the geometry was tightest and least forgiving. And more than once, the inevitable happened. The largest locomotive in the world simply climbed off the track and derailed. Read that back for a second, because it is genuinely remarkable. They had built a machine with 14 driving wheels, more wheels gripping the rail than any locomotive in history, and it still could not stay on the track. All those wheels and the rigid frame turned every one of them into a liability the moment the line stopped being straight. The engineers' clever fixes, the blind wheels and the sliding axles, had not solved the problem. They had only delayed the discovery of it. And there was a second, quieter humiliation underneath the derailments. Despite spreading its weight across all those axles, the AA-20 was still simply too heavy for the track it was supposed to serve. The numbers that looked so proud on the specification sheet translated on the actual railway into bent steel and a maintenance nightmare. So now we arrive at the question this whole story has been circling. Did it work or didn't it? And the honest answer is the cruelest one. In the single thing it was built to prove that a rigid locomotive could be this big, the AA-20 worked just well enough to demonstrate beyond any argument that it could not. It could pull. It could roll down a straight. It could pose for a photograph. It just couldn't do the one thing a locomotive exists to do, which is run the railway day after day around every curve the railway happens to have. A freight engine that can only be trusted on straight track is not a freight engine. It is a very expensive, very heavy ornament. The verdict came quickly, and it came in the most Soviet way imaginable, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a decision to simply build something else instead. A second AA-20 had been planned. It was never finished. The railways turned their attention and their budgets to a different, more sensible class of heavy locomotive that could actually negotiate the network it was meant to serve, and the giant was quietly set aside. There was no grand farewell, no place of honor. For a country that had welded a politician's name to the project and called it the future, the AA-20 had become an embarrassment best left unmentioned, and in that era, an unmentioned failure was often the safest kind to have for everyone whose name was attached to it. The locomotive was sent to a test facility on the edge of the network and left there, and it stayed for something like 25 years. The largest rigid locomotive ever built sat in storage, slowly forgotten, a monument to a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Then, around 1960, it was quietly cut up for scrap. No ceremony, no preservation campaign, no announcement that it had ever existed at all. Even the record it had held, the largest non-articulated steam locomotive in the world, had by then slipped away to an American machine, the Pennsylvania Railroad's S1, leaving the AA-20 with nothing but a footnote and a handful of photographs, most of which, fittingly, only ever showed its good side. If you find yourself fascinated by machines like this, the ones that pushed engineering so far past its breaking point that reality pushed back, then leave a comment and subscribe, because the history of the railways is full of giants that were never supposed to work, and some of them are stranger than anything you've just heard. Because in the end, the AA-20 is not really a story about a locomotive. It is a story about that line we started with, the line where bigger stops, meaning better, where ambition runs straight into the ground it has to stand on, and the ground wins. The Soviet engineers had treated a law of physics as if it were a political obstacle, something that could be overpowered with enough steel and enough will. The railway disagreed, and no amount of pride, no politician's name, and no 100-foot frame could change the simple fact that a thing too rigid to bend will, sooner or later, break whatever it cannot bend around. And yet that's only half the lesson. Because the AA-20 failed for one very specific reason, and it's a reason that points straight at its opposite. It failed because it refused to bend. So what happens when an engineer takes the other path entirely and builds a locomotive designed to flex, hinged and articulated, free to chase raw power without fighting the rails? It turns out one machine took that idea further than anyone thought possible and became the most powerful steam locomotive ever to turn a wheel, a true giant that actually ran. The AA-20 was the monster that couldn't move, the next one was the monster that could. And the story of how it earned that crown and whether it was worth the price is where we're going next.